Good evening, everybody, and you're very welcome to a packed my van, Marion Hall. I see among us poets, I see among us priests, I see among us prophets, all to come from the man of the four M's, John Moriarty, my van man, mystic and mythologian. You're very, very welcome to this special night. It's the first night of the 30th annual Village Festival, and to introduce you to the festival and to welcome you to the festival is the chairperson of the festival, Carmel Collins. Carmel Collins.
So, thanks very much, Gabriel. Good evening, everyone, and you're all very welcome here to my van. On behalf of my van Development Association and my van GAA, we're actually co-hosting this event. It's a very, very special year for our festival. We're celebrating our 30th anniversary, and we're delighted, absolutely delighted, to have such a unique event in celebrating one of our local sons to open the festival event. So really looking forward to a really unique and different night, I think. So look, after this evening's show, we're going to be serving some refreshments. So we'd be delighted if you join us to, I suppose, allow the conversation of the evening to continue. So we'll be doing that after the proceedings of this evening finish. Also, look, it's as I said, it's our 30th festival, so a big weekend in store for those, for everybody local, I suppose, and for people who might be staying around for the weekend as well. And just wanted to draw your attention, we have a raffle. We're running a raffle which will be done at the end of our festival, which is closing on Monday evening. Some really, really great prizes. The first two are 2 nights away, 2 nights of B&B, one in the Connacht Hotel in Galway and the other in the Great Southern, a junior suite in Killarney. And we also have sponsorship for a meal or afternoon tea for 4 in the famous Adair Manor. So some really good prizes, and there's 5 or 6 more prizes as well to follow that. So look, we'd appreciate your support. All proceedings go towards the Development Association, to all of our funding, and obviously to support the GAA as well. And we have a very active and up-and-coming senior team, moving their way up through the county ranks as well. So would really appreciate your support. We'll be selling those at the end of the show. So look, the festival lineup, we have, as I said, a very busy weekend. We have a GAA charity match tomorrow. And on Sunday, I suppose, is our really big event. We have a concert in our community sports hall down below, where we have the Rattlin' Rogues live in concert. So we're looking forward to a fantastic night on Sunday night. So just some housekeeping. Obviously the exits, should anything happen, I'm sure it won't, at the back of the hall to the left and right, and over here to my left as well are the exits, and obviously the toilets out the back doors and over to the left, or this one directly outside the back doors. So look, that's it for me. All I have left to say really is I hope you enjoy the night and take as much from it as you possibly can. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Carmel, and can I personally express my thanks on behalf of Mary McGillicuddy and Amanda Reardon to the Village Festival Committee for facilitating this wonderful evening. The idea came from the 2 ladies who are great supporters of John Moriarty, and they have done wonderful work to keep John Moriarty's name and his reputation alive, not just in Ireland, but in America and other places as well. So thank you very much to Mary and Amanda as well. Right, can I introduce on stage Jimmy O'Brien, the fiddle player, all the way from Glyn, County Limerick. And our main speaker, Martin Shaw. Now, the very first item is, can I tell you that when you leave the hall, turn on your mobile phones. We're going to have a few tunes from Diarmuid. He'll explain himself what he's going to do. So can you give a big My Van welcome, please, to Diarmuid O'Brien?
Thanks very much. Delighted to be here, part of this event. Thanks to Gabriel for asking me. So I'm going to start off with something that's, I suppose, nice and steady to get us into the evening. It's a tune that I wrote in 2016 after a time when my father passed away, and a neighbour came in one day and said it was like he was taken from the road. So he passed away after a short illness. So this is a little tune that I wrote, and I called it Taken from the Road. So here we go.
Thank you very much, Diarmuid, for a lovely tribute to his father. Now, I'm going to talk to you briefly about John Moriarty. John was born on the 2nd day of February 1938, the fourth child born to Jimmy Moriarty and Mary O'Brien. Jimmy Moriarty came from Ballinluckig, which is to the west of Dingle in the Gaeltacht area, and he was a native Irish speaker. He emigrated to Canada first of all. He didn't have a word of English, and he found it difficult out there. He got across the border somehow by stealth, got into America, and eventually made his way to Springfield, Massachusetts. Springfield, Massachusetts is where all the West Kerry people went. That's where all the Blasket Islanders went, for instance, to the steel industries there. And there he met Mary O'Brien, all the way from Leitrim East, or as we used to call it, Bargogeen. And they got married, and they returned to Ireland, and they bought the farm at Leitrim Hill. On the farm, it was a typical Irish farm at the time. You had cattle, you had hens, geese, turkeys, pigs, all the rest. And you had a kitchen garden as well. You would have had the cabbage and the potatoes, and also the mangles for the animals. And my van was a quiet, easygoing place at the time. There were 5 pubs, a cooperative creamery, 14 grocery shops, 2 forges, coopers, thatchers, a butter maker, a watchmaker, harness maker, shoemaker, and tailor. There was no electricity. I'm 70 years of age now, and I remember electricity coming to the village about 65 years ago. So John had to study by the light of a tilly lamp, an oil lamp in the kitchen at home. And John was very quiet. In a house of big talk, as he called it, John was the quiet one. And he went to Mutter National School, that's my van, the local national school, my van, on the 12th of May 1942, aged 4 years and 3 months. And he got on well there. He tells me that he wasn't the most enthusiastic of pupils, and he didn't make great progress in my van national school. But anyway, he went to St. Michael's in college in Listowel in 1951. And he cycled there. He went there with Johnny McGrath, his great friend, next door to him. And they went there. John said to me that he had no notion he was going to St. Michael's, except he saw Johnny McGrath getting a bicycle, and he wanted to get a bicycle too. So anyway, he went to St. Michael's, and he drove cycled all the way in. And at that time, St. Michael's was a classical college. They didn't teach French or Spanish or any modern language. They taught Latin and Greek. So you had English, Irish, Latin and Greek, and then you had maths and science and all the rest. And John initially reacted against that, and he said, Gabe, he said, he was calling me Gabe, he said, I was schooled in the grammars of 3 dead languages, Latin, Greek and Irish. Now, he changed his opinion after that. He radically changed his opinion, and he said, Gabriel, he said, I was privileged with the same education as John Milton, the great English poet. He had the same classical education of Latin and Greek as the great Milton had. And he was a footballer. Not many people remember John as a footballer, but he was a very fine footballer. He was the captain of the St. Michael's team that won the Dunlow Cup in 1955, and he was a centre half back. And he played minor football for my van as well. And I didn't know that until I was in my 20s. And John was at that time down at home minding his father and mother. And I said, Jesus, John, I said, I didn't realise you were a footballer. He said, Gabe, I said, he's a scratch his head. I wasn't a footballer at all. He said, all I wanted to do was get that bloody ball as far away from me as possible. He says, Chris, my brother, Chris won a North Kerry Championship medal with my van. He said, Chris was a footballer, he loved the ball. So that's the difference maybe between a footballer and a centre half-back, I don't know. But anyway, he did his leaving cert in 1956, and he was called to training to St. Patrick's Teachers Training College in Drumcondra, and he spent 2 years there. And as far as I can find out, he spent some time in Athay National School, and he spent some time in Portarlington National School. I also heard that he was in Avoca National School in County Wicklow, but they can't verify that for me in Avoca. The reason I have a contact with Avoca is that's where I began teaching myself. But anyway, John said his mother was as proud as punch when he came back with the teacher's diploma, because he was going to get a Morris Minor, she thought, and he was going to drive her around the country like a queen. But of course, John had different ideas. He didn't want to teach at all. He gave up teaching, and he persuaded his father, Jimmy, to cash in his shares in Standard Oil to pay for him to study philosophy at UCD. And he did, and he got a double first-class honours on graduation from UCD. Then he went to England, and he tutored in Leeds University in England for a year, and then he got a lucky break, and he was called to the University of Manitoba at Winnipeg, and he spent 6 years there teaching English literature. And he said to me, Gabe, it was all wrong. He said, it was all wrong, he said. Because here I was at 40 degrees below zero, teaching John Keats, "Oh, for a beakerful of the warm south." He said, there's no warm south in the winter in Canada, and here I was telling lies to these pupils. But anyway, when he left Manitoba, he came back to England, where he worked as a part-time gardener in the Carmelite monastery in Oxford. And then he returned to Ireland in 1971, and he worked first of all for the Guinnesses in Strafford as a gardener, and then in Ballyhinch Castle in Connemara, and then he retired to Mangerton, to Cooley's, the side of the Mangerton Mountain. He also applied for a job to the Knight of Glyn as a gardener. And the Knight of Glyn knew his history, and he said he couldn't apply a Moriarty, because at one stage it was a Moriarty that killed the Earl of Desmond, so he was a Fitzgerald. So history goes long time. Right, I remember John as a kid. I grew up listening to John. My mother, who was an invalid, had a great interest in literature, poetry especially, and art. And John and herself would discuss poetry at length, while I, as a dipper, would be beside them at 3 and 4 years of age, listening to them with these big words. And one day they had a long discussion on that very famous poem by John Keats, The Ode to Autumn. And of course it was all above my head, and when John was gone I asked my mother, I didn't know about the ode, I said, where was the road to autumn, how would you get it? But anyway, John also had a great charitable sense. He didn't dress the most expensively at that time. And my mother said, for God's sake, would you get yourself a suit of clothes, John? And John said, Maud, he said, why should I have 2 suits of clothes when I can give one to Oxfam? So then we all know the story how when, as a teenager, he read The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, which John was brought up in the biblical story of 7 days creation, and suddenly Darwin throws the whole thing overboard, and John says he was man overboard. He fell out of his own story, and he spent the rest of his life finding his own story again. John, in his youth, my family was a conservative, Catholic community, mindful of its character, its history and its traditions. Eventually, he spread his wings, as I said, and he brought his culture and his tradition with him everywhere. He died on the 1st of June 2007 at the age of 69. And can I tell you, he was a great storyteller. He was a born storyteller. And Andy O'Mahony, the first night he was in Andy O'Mahony, the radio show on RT Radio 1. Andy O'Mahony said, tonight's guest is John Moriarty, the most extraordinary man I've ever met. And I was teaching in the local school at the time, so the following morning about 9 o'clock, I was going down to the school and I met John's sister, Brenda. And I said, Brenda, did you hear John on the radio last night? Christ, she said, I did. She said, I heard Andy O'Mahony say, tonight's guest is John Moriarty, and that's the first and last thing I understood on that programme. I remember the time that John Moriarty gave his first lecture in Listowel. It was with Father Pat Moore, and it was a Lenten lecture in the convent hall in Listowel, and it was packed. And I picked up John in Tralee at the station at 7. The talk was 8, and on the way out I said, John, I said, will you speak for maybe 50 minutes and give 10 minutes questions? Gabe, he said, I'm going to talk for 4 hours. Which he did. And he held everybody in the palm of his hand. There was a tea break at 10 o'clock at half-time after 2 hours, and nobody left. So eventually we went back to Connie Reardon's house, Amanda's house, her father's and mother's house, Phyllis's, and between about 12:30 at night and 5 in the morning, we had 25 cups of tea each. The reason I remember it is I have never felt as bad in all my life. I never got a hangover as bad after Arthur Guinness, I'll tell you the truth. Now, John was a great storyteller, and I'm just going to tell you 2 brief anecdotes from his stories, and I let the other people tell who know more about it than I do. John was working in Ballyhinch Castle in Connemara, and he had a great friend called Martin Hollerton, and Martin was a man of the earth. And John begins his story. 'Twas after closing time, and Martin was proud of God. There's two as Christ as Martin, I'm proud of God. Put it there, John Moriarty, the coldest day in winter and the hottest day in summer, you were my best friend. But Martin was drunk. And after a while, the drink went to his head. And he said, we're lost. John said, you're not lost. We are lost. He said, I don't know where I am. So then John said, look, here you are. He said, there's Lynn's place. Down the road is P.T. Welch's place. Down the road again is somebody else's place. And he says, places, places, places. You have me mesmerised with places. Anyway, he got into his front gate. And I said, no, Martin. He said, you're at your front gate, he said. And the door is in there. Oh, God, says Martin, sure, I know well where I am now, John, I know well where I am. But where in the fuck am I? John, that was a metaphysical question for John, where was he in the grander scheme of things. There's another story he tells, Martin told it to him. Martin was trying to say to him that, John, you don't go to Mass and you would want to turn your life around. And this was his way of saying it. John, he said, there was a man sitting on the sea wall, and this, on the ditch rather, not the sea wall, and this tourist came by in a car, and he stopped and he said, am I on the right road for Carna? And the Connemara man said, you what? He said, you were on the right road for Carna, but you were turning the wrong way. And John said, I know what you're saying to me, Martin, I am on the right road to God, but I'm turning the wrong way. And the other one, the last one I leave you with, is the one about in Ballyhinch Castle during the winter, when the workmen there would be getting the place ready to open again in the spring. And one of the men, I think his name was called Bill, he was cutting lino. And he was cutting it crooked. And John would be a very gentle soul. He wouldn't say, you're cutting that crooked, you know. He said, Bill, no. He said, God bless you, Bill. He said, but he said, is there any chance, he said, that's not straight? He said, that you're cutting it crooked. And Bill said, John, this is a lovely old place, he says. And in lovely old places like this, there's no such thing as a straight line. The only way to cut a straight line in a place like this is to cut it crooked. So there's some of John's. What he was saying there is when Jesus said, or when John the Baptist said, make straight the way of the Lord, maybe we can also go crooked to the Lord. That's what John was saying. So anyway, I've said my bit. Can I now introduce you to his niece, the person more than anybody who's responsible with Mary McGillicuddy for having us this gathering here this evening, Amanda Reardon.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. I'm going to be doing some readings from John's own work. John wrote some fantastic passages about my van and about Leitrim Middle. And as much as it is a celebration of John Moriarty, it is a celebration of all the Moriartys. It's a celebration of neighbours and friends and community. There's a word I came across lately. It's an Irish word, Ceilura it's called. And Ceilura was where people gathered to celebrate things, and it's an old Irish word. And generally what happened apparently in ancient Ireland is there would be a sacred tree. There would be a tree in the middle of the community where people would come to celebrate occasions, and this would be Ceilura would be the name of the event. Well, in Moriarty's house there was kind of a place where people gathered as well, and people came around, they sat by the fire, they told stories, they brought the talk of the day, and that was, Moriarty's was an open house, it was an open door, an open gate, and people just wandered in. John tells a story about some of the farmers coming from the creamery. My grandmother was the attraction because she had a very good personality. She was very witty, very humorous, and she was an intelligent woman, so people who come in to have a kind of a debate or a chat with her. But John tells about the horses or the donkeys coming from the creamery in my van. And on days when the farmer might not want to come in, he might have to go to the fair or he might have something to do, that the farmer would have a battle at Moriarty's gate to keep the horse from going in, to keep him straight, to keep him going down the road. So I suppose I'm here to speak more about the Moriarty family and the Leitrim, Middle Leitrim Hill connection. People would come in the evening and they'd sit by the fire, and particularly a bachelor that lived up the road, Jamie Cassan, had a huge influence on John Moriarty. If there was work to be done, they'd just fall in with the work. You wouldn't be invited. So if there was a shoe to be repaired or if there was something else to be done in the house, these callers would just fall in and do it. On this particular evening, there was thatching going on, and the scallops, scallops is the word, were being prepared for the thatching that was going to be done the next day. And Jamie and Jack Scanlon from down the road called, and this is a little passage that John writes from, it's from his book Nostos. Something there is about local people doing a local job, a job that has to be done, a job that neighbours come in to give a hand with. It seems to bring out the best in things as well as the best in people. The house never shelters a people so well as it does on such a night. The fire never flames so well. The home-baked bread baked in a 4-legged cast-iron oven with red coals under it and red coals on its lid. It somehow tastes better tonight, and the talk is better, and all the while the work is going on, and the talk is going on. The sparrows all chat during the day are asleep in their burrows under the eaves. So John wrote beautiful passages like that, simple passages, because I think the general consensus is that John is very difficult to read, but within those difficult philosophical passages there are the most simple and beautiful kind of poetic parts as well. John Moriarty, right, Moriarty is a Dingle name, so the Dingle connection is my grandfather, Jimmy Moriarty, was from Dingle. He was from Ballinluckig, as Gabriel has already said. A very, very poor background. The Moriartys lived on a small little holding on the foot of Mount Brandon, and Jimmy had a very hard life, really. I wrote this piece for the launch of Mary McGillicuddy's book, and I read it in Dingle, the home place of Jimmy Moriarty, so I might just read it again. My grandfather, Jimmy Moriarty, left Dingle, the place of his birth, in Ballinluckig when he was 18 years old, not knowing if he would ever return. He travelled by foot to Dingle, by train to Belfast, by ship to Quebec and Canada, and then on to his destination in Springfield in the USA. To board the train that would take him away from his roots in Dingle, he had already been on an epic journey. He was a very young child when his father died. His mother was an invalid, and she also died before her youngest son, Jimmy, was 7 years of age. Jimmy held dear a single memory of his mother, as a young lad climbing the hill in front of their home in Ballinluckig, sitting there watching and waiting for the ass and car to appear on the winding road from Dingle, knowing that it was his mother returning home. That memory was a treasure that he carried with him throughout his entire life. That is the story he told to his own children and grandchildren. With his parents gone, life was challenging for the growing boy. Survival was more important than education, and by the age of 12, he was working as a farm servant. The community of Ballinluckig had in their own way minded him, and he claimed that he was a favourite among all the local women who watched out for him and gave him food and clothes. Life as a farm servant was difficult, the work was hard, and oftentimes he was hungry and had to resort to stealing eggs and eating food set aside for animals. In the end, Jimmy was placed in a decent family who helped him to save the fare to America, where his siblings, many of his siblings had gone before him. So he arrived in Springfield. The story goes, he arrived in Springfield. He hadn't a word of English. He got his first pair of shoes for the journey. He wasn't able to read or write, and he took off, and he entered America through Canada. So he came down that way. Obviously, there was no phones, there was no contact in those days, and Jimmy stood at a street corner in Springfield, Massachusetts, and he waited 2 days until somebody he recognised in the crowd passed by, and they were from Dingle, and then he was guided to his sister's house or whatever, so one of his relatives. So that's the way it was done on that day, which is hard to believe, but it's fascinating that he worked 3 jobs and he made his few bucks there. So, and he was delighted. He would have been happy to stay there, actually. He met Mary O'Brien. Mary O'Brien was a tall, strong woman. She was one of 10 children from Borrogogeen. The O'Briens were also from a very poor background, but unlike the Moriartys, they were very well educated, really. They had Irish and they had a good standard of education. There was overcrowding in a lot of houses. They lived in a cottage acre in a small house. Mary, being one of the middle children, she was fostered. I call it fostering, but what would often happen in those days is a family that wouldn't have children of their own, they might take in a child. So Mary spent a good few years in Tarmans, and she obviously kept the connections with home as well. But home was devastated because they got TB in the house. And Mary lost 3 of her siblings and her uncle to TB, and as soon as she was 18 as well, she headed for Springfield in Massachusetts. And the story goes that she was walking down the street with a friend, and she said, who's that good-looking fella across the road? And her friend advised her, oh, stay away from him, he's from Dingle, he has the first penny he ever made. And if anything, I think that made Mary even more determined. They met at a dance later that week or in the coming weeks, and they obviously danced and they got married, and they had their first child, Madeline. She was born in Springfield. Jimmy would be happy to settle there, but Mary was very anxious to come home, and she longed to be at home in my van where her roots were. So Mary O'Brien came home with her daughter, 6 months old to 9 months old, and it took 6 weeks to travel at that stage. So she travelled home on a boat, and apparently she was very sick all the way home. She had the price of a farm somewhere in her possession, and she had a small child. So she came back to Borrogogeen, and with her father, they bought the place in my van off the Welches. And Jimmy returned then, and they tried to make a go of things at farming on Leitrim Hill. Leitrim Hill was the address. It was difficult times to be farming, and sometimes they didn't have a lot of money, and there were times where Jimmy would be away. So for a lot of John's early childhood, his father was in London working, and he would send home money, and Mary managed the house at home on her own. She was a powerful woman, and she was able to do that, but she had very much, Jimmy had 2 parents. I would say he had 3 parents, because the third person that was very much involved in his care was my Auntie Madeline. And he writes a beautiful passage about Auntie Madeline, a beautiful tribute to Auntie Madeline on Nostos also. So this is at a time when he was at home from Canada. I'll just get a drink. So he visited Madeline and her family. And I visited Madeline and her family. Being the oldest of us, it was Madeline who used to bath us in the tub in front of the fire every Sunday evening. It was she who fluffed up my curls the first morning I went to school. And it was she who rigged up the bike and sent me to St. Michael's. Madeline had a big part in rearing us. She was now rearing her own family, and doubtless she would have a big hand in rearing the grandchildren. And though she would often quote my mother, who used to say, "'Tis the second clutch that killed the old hen." In her own house and in her own yard, Madeline is proof of the existence of God, the God that Christians believe in, the God who over 30 years was happy to be in no way remarkable. Madeline's fire meets you at her door, and it is a short walk to her table. This is beautiful tribute to Madeleine, and she was a powerful woman. Leitrim Hill was a place, it was a magical place really. It was a place of hard work, sometimes arguments, sometimes trouble, sometimes all sorts of things. A very colourful family and plenty of colours. There was always very neighbourly. I mean, we had the McGraths living, or the McGraths lived next door to the Moriartys, and there was a very close bond between the Moriartys and the McGraths, and there still is, because if you drive down the Bally Road on any given day, you could meet my mother Phyllis and Nell, now in their golden years, walking together and chatting about what's going on. So that bond hasn't been broken. But the other person that used to call and had the most influence of all on John Moriarty, I would have to say, is Jamie Cassan. And if it's okay, I'll read you a passage and what John writes about Jamie. Every evening, as darkness was falling, Jamie Cassan would come to our house. To us, Jamie was as old as the fog and as wise as the bushes. Given how he lived and the few clothes he lived in, the long months of winter were hard on him. It was a comfort to him to come in and sit in under our chimney breast. There he was out of the way of the draught, and there he also got the full benefit of the fire. But it wasn't only the fire that revived him. On the hearth in front of him, at this time of evening, there would be a three-legged cast-iron oven with coals beneath it and coals on its lid. The last loaf of the day was being baked, and at that time too, just before supper, the kettle also of cast iron would be spitting from within the flames that engulfed it on every side. A tall, thin man with a small appetite, Jamie would eat by the fire. A sense I had of him, it was, if Bogdale could talk, it would talk as Jamie talked. Certainly he was out of a past as old as Bogdale that he talked, and that suited the kind of fireplace we all sat at. Cutting turf every year in the bog, we worked our way down into a world no human being had ever set foot on. By midday every day for 5 days we would be uncovering the floor of an ancient forest. So he's talking about the bogs there and uncovering Bogdale. And that's how I thought of Jamie Cassan, coming as he did every night at nightfall. He was, in a sense, the nightfall man. And if a tree stump just uncovered could talk, it would talk as he talked. And the light of our paraffin lamp wouldn't wither such talk. How soft it was, the light of our lamp. The light of our lamp didn't drive all darkness from our house. The light of our lamp didn't drive all darkness from our minds. Some nights, as if in seance, our lamp called the darkness to it, and our minds too. Talking to us in the way that he did, Jamie Cassan uncovered the Bogdale in our minds. And in school next morning, how almost impossible it was to give serious heed to a teacher talking about prepositions or fractions. How almost impossible it was to sit in the bare desk and give serious heed to a man talking about a golden age, a silver age, and a bronze age. And there was one particular night that Jamie called, and my grandmother had a hatching hen under the table in a butter box under the kitchen table, and Jamie had plans to repair John's shoe, I think it was, and John continues and he tells this story, and this is one of my favourite passages actually. So there was iron in our world and there was iron in our house, but we didn't have the mind to go with it. One night Jamie picked up a boot of mine and saw that it needed a new half sole. He asked me to bring him the hammer, the last, the tack, and a strip of leather from the right drawer of the dresser. Instantly and emphatically my mother said no, pointing to the hen hatching in a wooden butter box under the table. No, she said, that will have to wait for another night. Didn't we know, she asked, that the sound of hammering might kill the chicks and the eggs? Again, 3 or 4 days later, hearing Chris hammering outside in the hay shed, she went to the door and called out to him to stop at once. In our house, we lived from the belief that the sound of iron on iron was lethal. In our house, the metallurgical ages gave way to the hatching hen. So yeah, John Moriarty had a very wild and carefree childhood in North Kerry, in Leitrim Hill, and I suppose he never lost that wildness. He never wanted to be fenced in, and he struggled to be fenced into any sort of system, whether it was a university system or an education system. He kept that kind of original wildness always, which is very much a Moriarty trait. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Amanda was referring there to decimals and prepositions and stuff like that. I remember one story that John told. John, like myself, didn't have a great love of mathematics. In other words, we were damn bad at him. And John couldn't figure out multiplication. Because he said multiplication is ipso facto supposed to mean that something gets bigger. You multiply and it gets bigger. And then he says, you came to halves. You multiply 2 halves and you got a quarter. How can that make it bigger? That had him bamboozled for all his life. But anyway, now I'm going to ask Stephen O'Brien to come again and entertain you with another set of tunes. Dermot.
Thanks very much. So I'm going to continue with a few slip jigs, and they're from the playing of a renowned concertina and fiddle player from Athay in West Limerick, and her name was Mrs. Dalton, and such was her musical status back in the 1950s and 60s that she was recorded by Ciarán MacMahuna, and she was also recorded by Sean O'Riordan when he was compiling his collection, My Musical Heritage, which was a demonstration of various musical styles around Ireland at a time when styles were probably more prevalent than they are now due to the availability of music today. So these are 2 slip jigs that she played, and the first one is called Last Night's Fun, and the second one is called Hardy Man the Fiddler, but it's her version of it that you wouldn't normally hear, so we'll give him a go.
Thank you, Diarmuid. Diarmuid comes from a great tradition of fiddle playing in West Limerick. He spoke there of Mrs. Dalton. There was also a great fiddle player in Knockfinich called Pat Nina Patrick Ahern. Buddy Fury, another great fiddle player from Glenside. Great flute player that was also recorded by Sean O'Reilly, John Joe Hatton from Strand. And of course, closer to our own time, the great Martin Mulville of Ballygaughlan, who would have been a big influence on Diarmuid. And one of Martin's favourite tunes was one he composed himself, which was called The Pride of My Van. So we have a reel called after this, composed by Martin Mulville. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce to you Martin Shaw, the main speaker for the night. He's an award-winning author, a mythographer and a storyteller. He is currently reader in poetics at Darrington Art School, Devon, and he founded both the oral tradition and mythic life courses at Stanford University in California. He has written, I've had the pleasure of buying this last year, a book on John Moriarty called The Hut at the Edge of the Village, John Moriarty, edited by Martin Shaw. So ladies and gentlemen, will you put your hands together please for Martin Shaw.
Thank you. Hello. Can you hear me? I'm going to need a chair. I'll take this one. So a joke for John Moriarty. Long time ago, there was a young monk with a lot of love to give and no one to give it to. He was making away across Ireland and he didn't know what to do with all this energy that he had. So he came to a monastery and he said to the abbot, "Is there anything at all that I can do around here? Anything at all?" And the abbot said, "There is. Down in the belly of the monastery, there is the one set of rules that we wrote about how to be a monk. These are the rules of monastic life. If you could give us a copy, that would be great." So the young lad disappeared down into the belly of the place. About an hour later, this wailing, this gnashing of teeth, this crying came from the centre of the monastery. And the abbot ran downstairs and he said, "What on earth is the problem, young man?" Now this takes a second, but it's worth it. He said, "What's the problem?" And the lad said, "In the original set of rules, there was a spelling mistake. It's meant to say, celebrate." Question. So I'll begin with a story that John loved to tell. Many of you will know it. So maybe you'll remember him telling it, as I do. A long, long time ago, there was a hunter. And it was the end of the day and the hunter was making his way back to his hut. And just as he got to the hut, he saw something that scared him. He saw a thin trail of blue smoke coming from the chimney. It meant someone was in there. He got to the door, he peered in. Sure enough, someone had prepared a meal. Someone had taken his tattered clothes and put them together and cleaned them. No one had ever been that kind to the hunter before. A few days later, he comes back early and he sees her. He sees her. There was a woman cooking and she had her back turned to him. And she had a great flood of red hair all the way down to her waist. And as the hunter looked at her, he knew in the way that hunters know that this was part woman, part fox, part spirit of the forest. And she knew, like all women know when they're being watched. So she turned and she announced to him, it wasn't a question, it was an announcement. She said, "I shall be the woman of this hut." And the hunter said, "Yeah, good idea." It was a sweet evening, that first evening they had together. They were in radiant contentment. They had a little candle, they had a little conversation, a little to eat. It turned out that fox women have a lot of jokes. Who knew? Who knew? Fox women have the jokes, he had the songs, and love, or something like it, moved between them like the sighing of the tides. There was just this one thing. Now, if you're a fox woman, you have a pelt. And sure enough, she was no exception. And so her pelt hung on the back of the wall, of the door, in fact, on a nail. Now, for a while, the hunter didn't notice this. But, you know, you're a rural audience. You will know that fox pelts, they give off a bit of a regal stink after a while. And he's so caught up in the love affair, he doesn't know how to bring it up. But there comes a night, 3, 4, 5 months into it, and he says something like this. "Bright pulse of my whole understanding, sky woman of the dawn, you were more tuneful than the fiddle, you are a ship in full sail in a mistless wave, you are whiter than the swan on the pool." There's just this one thing. There's just this one thing. Would you consider moving the pelt out of the hut? It's not that I don't like the pelt. It's not that I don't disapprove of the pelt. I'm not trying to domesticate you exactly, but the pelt has a strong smell. Could we just move it 100 yards from the hut? She looked at him and she smiled and she sort of bent her head in a rather foxy way and said nothing. Well, time passes and time passes and time passes. And you know, there comes another evening, and I think he's had the bacine out, and I don't think it's so sweet between them. And he puts his hand on the table and he says, "I told you before. I asked you before. I'm being very clear now. Get rid of the pelt." In the morning, the fox woman was gone. In the morning, the pelt was gone. And in the morning, the scent of the pelt was gone. And they say, and say truly to this day, the hunter stands in the doorway of the hut, lonely in his whole body for the pelt and the scent of the foxwoman. John loved that story. Loved that story. He'd say the stories we need now need to be written on that pelt. And I think he's right. I was recently in Letterkenny. I was walking down the street, it was getting dark, and a man came out of something called Paddy Power. And he saw me, and he kept on walking, and he stopped, and he turned, and he came back, and he put one finger out on the brim of my hat, and he said, "That hat is too big for this town." And then he just disappeared into the mist. It's funny, isn't it? We've all had moments like that in our lives. Sometimes you've got to wear the hat that's a bit too big. Sometimes you've got to get the hat knocked off. But I've been thinking about John. In the later stages of his life, there's these very famous photographs of him surrounded by books. There's thousands of books. He did the reading so we didn't have to. That's what Keith Richards from the Rolling Stones always says. He says, "I do the drugs so you don't have to." Well, John did the reading so we don't have to. But I look at John and I always see those books as a kind of Stonehenge of education. I was in Letterkenny again, actually, later that night in a wonderful pub called The Cottage, and a guy paid me a compliment. He said, "When you die, it'll be a great library that burns to the ground." But that really was John. That's a compliment that belongs to John. But I thought about the loneliness that he must have carried with him, as well as all the deep friendships. It's so sweet. There is not I've been on the road for about a month. You'll hear this in my voice. But there was nowhere I went where at the end of the night someone wouldn't come out of the crowd and say, "I knew John Moriarty." Some people say, "I knew him in a gardening capacity." Some people knew him as a storyteller. Some people knew him as a writer. But as you were kind to mention in the introduction, I work all over the world. And the interesting thing is, every year that John passes, his reputation, especially with younger folk, is just growing and growing and growing and growing and growing. It's extraordinary. And if you do struggle with the books, find your way to the live recordings. Just hear him, hear the rhythm, hear the cadence, hear the stories, because the stories will pull you in. And with that, I will tell this story for John Moriarty. It's an old one from these islands. You ready for a story?
Yes.
And it's got your name in it, dear mate. It was the end of the day, it was the end of the day, it was the end of the day. And the Fianna had been hunting up on Ben Bulben. You'll know that place. And of course there was Finn. It's so true. If the rivers of the world were spun of pure silver, if the leaves on the trees were spun of pure gold, Finn would have given them all away. And wherever Finn went, on his right, he had handsome Diarmaid, often with his fiddle. If you're handsome in one of the old stories, they mention that you had a lot of freckles. And Diarmaid had a lot of freckles, and you'll remember that he had a mark on his face. And if you saw that mark, you would fall woefully, catastrophically in love with him. So Finn's there, Dermot's on one side, and on the other is a man called Conan Mal, Crow-Bald Conan. A man utterly bald on the top of his head, but his back, the hairs on his back, from shoulder to shoulder, down to the crack of Dunlow. See what I did? It was so black and so curly that all the socks and gloves and vests of Finn's men were made from the hair of Conan Mal's back. Some of you have met men like this. So we've got Conan on one side, we've got Diarmaid on the other, we've got Finn in the middle, and they come across something. Finally, at the end of the day, the dogs are there. And they're protecting a young doe. Finn immediately recognises that this is an animal from the She, this is an animal from the people of the hill, this is an old fairy beast. And so he gets everybody down, hunkering down in the long grasses. And he says, I place protection on this animal. I place all my poetry, all my blessings, all my warriorship to look after this beast. And so the doe is taken back to the settlement. Now that night, Finn is preparing to go to sleep. And he's up in his chambers and there's a knock at the door. He goes to the door, he opens the door, and there she is. Standing there is a woman he will love his whole life. The type you don't get over. He greeted her formally, he went into the shadows of the room, he pulled his own heart from his chest, he said, you could have told me this was about to happen. Puts it back in, goes to the door and says, who are you? She says, you've met me before. Only a few hours ago I was the doe. I come from the people of the hill. I come from the people of the She. I come from the gentry. I come from the other folk. Where I come from, we call them the Benji. They're very real beings, very real, and very respectful to them. And he says, well, what can I do for you? And she says, the trouble is, I've fallen in love. I have fallen in love. And it's about time that I married someone. And his heart is sinking. His heart is sinking. He says, well, go on, tell me about this man. And she says, well, the thing is, every night in the land of the fairy, the storytellers tell stories of one man. He's an Irishman. He's a poet. He's a warrior. He's sensitive, he's funny, he's magnificent. Now Finn, who's not always the sharpest pencil in the pack, his heart is sinking. He says, where will this man be? We will explore the highways, the byways, the travellers' camps. We will not rest until we have found this Irish warrior poet. And he will be presented to you, even though there's one tear coming down his face because he's wild in love with her. Her name, by the way, is Sive. She says, Finn, are you not picking up the signals? I'm going to take a few more steps towards you now, Finn. Okay, let me tell you a bit more. It turns out, in the land of fairy, that their mythologies and their stories are made from the events of our lives, which is why here in Moyvan, here tonight, we have to live interesting enough lives to be told round the fire of the fairy people. Who knew? Who bloody knew? So, she said, men have come courting me recently, and a great magician came, a man called the Dark Man of the She. He wanted to marry me. He spoke to me sweetly, then he spoke to me persuasively, and then finally he spoke to me angrily. And when I would not marry him because I'm all wrapped up crazy in love with this mythological Irishman, he produced a thin hazel wand. He touched me once on my shoulder and I became a deer. I became a deer. But I knew if this figure from the stories was real, I would find him at the hazy place of Penbolden. And sure enough, I found my way there today. You found me. Here you are. Finn, have you figured it out yet? In case there's any ambivalence whatsoever, in case I can't draw this with one line for you, I claim you. I claim you. Well, that was the news that he wanted to hear. They fell mad in love with each other. It may have been a few years since you've been around people that have just fallen madly in love with each other. It's attractive for a minute, and then it's a bit annoying, isn't it? It's a wee bit annoying. Because Finn is no longer a good hero. Conan Nall never sees him, Crotcha never sees him, Quaveen never sees him, no one sees him. They disappear early from the feasts. And they lie on a bearskin robe under 100,000 stars, drinking mead or something like it. So, everyone was relieved when Vikings came and invaded the Bay of Dublin, because this was a reason they could, the old Irish knock, they could knock on the door and they could get him out. He didn't want to leave. He was sad to leave. But he said to his beloved, he said, would you do me this one thing? The night that I come back from the battle, would you stand up at the turrets of the settlement waiting for me? Because if I know you're there, it'll give me courage to get through this and get to you. She said, of course I will. I'll be back as soon as I possibly can. So with that, Finn and the whole ensemble, the whole gang, the whole Fianna, and the hounds and the chariots, and they were there and they were singing, their weapons were wrapped in flowers, they all headed off. This day, they were victorious over the Vikings. The Vikings were so upset they went away and said, we'll get our revenge in about 1800 years with something called IKEA. But before then, we've got a lot to work through emotionally. Finn was preparing to leave, and the men were upset. They loved Finn. They wanted to be with Finn. And Conan Nall said, what good is a feast without Finn? What good is a feast without Finn? What good is a feast without Finn? But he still left, didn't he? And he was almost home and the dawn was coming and he looked up at the settlement walls. But Sive was not there. She was not there. He ran in, he grabbed the nearest man and he said, where is she, where is she, where is she? Now the man he happened to bump into has an extraordinary name, Cronin the Buzzer. Now, Cronin the Buzzer was his right-hand man. Cronin was frightened of nothing, but he was pale when Finn spoke to him. He said, all night long she waited for you. She said, I want to greet the father of my unborn child. There is a spark of light growing in the lowly croft of her hips. I want to greet the father of my unborn child. She was wrapped in your fur, she was there all night, but just before dawn, we knew you wouldn't be back. But we saw you, we all saw you, coming with your chariot and the hounds, and she saw you, and she ran down, she ran through the gate, she ran towards you over the long grasses. You ran towards her, you put your arms out for her, and at the last minute, you produced a thin hazel wand. You touched her on her shoulder, and she became a deer. And you and her disappeared into the darkness and were not seen. I'm so sorry, Finn. There was nothing, anything, any of us could have done. Well, you will know that next to every lover's chamber there is a small room filled with crow feathers. And it is the business of love. It is the debt of love, sometimes, that we have to lie in it. And for a day and a night, Finn was not seen. But when he came out, you can imagine, he's going to search, he's going to split the land in half, trying to find his beloved. So he did. And for a while, his men went with him. But you know, 6 months in, a year in, 18 months in, one by one, the men started to disappear. No one could face leaving him like this directly, so they'd leave in the middle of the night. Until finally, one day, Finn woke up and he was all alone. He continued to search, he continued to search, he continued to search. The old poets say and say truly, he made an altar in his heart for the bird that had flown away. Finally, conscience pricked some of the men, and they went searching for their old captain again. I don't know in your life if you've ever been on the wrong side of something. It's one of the delights of being middle-aged. It happens. But they said, you know, we'd rather be on a foolish errand with our captain than completely alone here. So they found him, and they ended up taking him back hunting to Ben Bulben, where our story begins. And sure enough, it was a day rather like the first day. And sure enough, the hounds caught something. They were protecting something. In fact, they were protecting not a doe, but a little boy. And as soon as the little lad saw Finn, it walked with no fear towards him and placed his little hand in the big hand of Finn. And Finn knew at that moment he was in the presence of his son, his lad. He took the boy back to the camp, you can imagine, and the lad couldn't speak a language that we could decipher. He spoke a strange, antlered language. But over the years that followed, bit by bit, Finn managed to get out of him what had happened. That he was indeed his son, that this lad had travelled through the land of Faerie with his mother, and that bit by bit she'd said to him, if you ever find me turned into a deer again, get yourself to Ben Bulben and you will locate your father. That is what she said. Somewhere out there in the underworld or the other world is my mother, your beloved. Well, Finn heard that, and he named the boy Oisin, little deer. you will know that Ossian became an even greater poet than his dad. You will know that when steely-eyed Patrick of the many conversions turned up here, even he couldn't resist having a chat with Ossian about his father. And so a 300-year-old Ossian told him all the stories, many of which I know, but I cannot tell you here tonight because we won't be here till Christmas. But you can always invite me back. And at the very end, Ossian said to Paddy, "Is my father in heaven or is he in hell?" And Paddy went, and Ossian got up. This old 300-year-old pagan tree of a man got up and he said, "Ungenerous is your God." And he went to hell and he got his father back. But that is another story, but I do know it. But I shall leave us with the boy speaking the strange antlered language to Finn. Because the poets we love, like John, they understood that strange antlered language. They paid the price required to be able to speak it. It's a hard road. There's a reason why most of the great bards were blind. You lose something as you were given that gift. So, John, thank you for everything you continue to give to us. And I say this, let that story bless the ones that heard it. Let that story bless the one that told it. And let that story bless the ones that are to come. Thank you very much.
Worth waiting for, as they say. Thank you so much, Martin. The wisdom of the ages, the wisdom of the sages. We're now going to be blessed with a tune, a slow air from Dermot again. So, Dermot, can you come and to the microphone, please?
So, thanks very much. So, when Gabriel asked me to play a slow air here tonight, I chose a slow air that has connections with West Limerick and Glynn, where I grew up, and it's a slow air from the poet Sean Éireach O'Shanachán, who was a Tulla native from County Clare, but settled in the banks of the Shannon in Glynn in the 1800s, and he struggled throughout his life with addiction to alcohol. And he wrote this poem about that struggle he had, and it's called An Buachail Quail Dove. And funny enough, I recorded this on an album I did about 2 years ago with Donny O'Sullivan from Corrie, who's a fabulous flute player. And the slow air, I suppose, was first brought to my attention by a school teacher I had in Ballygilton, in National School, where I went, Mrs. Julia Ryan. And she often asked me to play the air when I was young, learning music, and I never knew it. But so I sent her a copy of the CD, and I mentioned that on the CD that she'd asked me to play the air all those years ago. So she sent me a lovely letter, and I suppose we often wonder whether the tune came first or the poet, because it's a beautiful melody to the air. And she sent me a lovely letter back, and she outlined that the Knight of Glynn told her many years ago that a Houlihan man from Glynn was travelling from Glynn to Ballyhale one night and slept in a fairy fort, and he woke up hearing the melody to this air. So that is the story of how this melody came about. So here we go.
I think we're on. Yeah, I think the applause says it all. On Buchan Dove, the dark, slender boy. Scholars tell us the dark, slender boy is a pint of Guinness. Fact, not joking. We also call a pint of Guinness here the blonde in the black skirt. You know, the blonde in the black skirt. But it's a beautiful tune, and the first time I heard it was, I wasn't at the concert, it was 1969, that famous concert that O'Reilly had at the Gaiety with Tori Coolin and Sean O'Shea sang on Buchan Dove. First time I heard the song, a beautiful song. Can I now introduce you to Mary McGillicuddy? Mary is one of the main reasons why we're here tonight. She has been indefatigable in her pursuit and study and promotion of John Moriarty. She wrote a fantastic book, which is still available and totally readable, might I say, on John Moriarty, called Not the Whole Story. She has been responsible for the education of a generation of boys and girls as principal teacher of Tarbert National School, where she distinguished herself as a brilliant educator and a great leader. Will you please put your hands together for Mary McGillicuddy?
Thank you, Gabriel. I really think I should go home because I haven't anything like as entertaining to offer you as what you've heard already here this evening. Tarbert Comprehensive School. I just have to correct that. It was you put me back in the national school, Gabriel, in Tarbert, and I don't want to be taking credit for what I didn't do. It's absolutely fantastic to be here. It's amazing, Diarmuid, that piece of music, all the music you've played. Diarmuid and I go back a long way. Diarmuid and I go back to Tarbert Comprehensive School. He was sitting in front of me in a classroom there. And that first piece, Taken from the Road, I just thought was very, very, very special. And as he was playing it, I was thinking, taken from the road, and I know exactly what John Moriarty would have said to him. He would have said, taken from one road, but now walking another. So, and the music, I think, even had that in it. So thank you, Diarmuid, for all you've done there. I think I've actually never been so nervous facing a crowd as I was coming out here to my van tonight. I was aware of the genius I was coming here to be with. I have been watching Martin Shaw's YouTube talks, stories, listening to him and being enthralled. And then I had Amanda, and I knew she was going to blow it away with telling you all about her stories from Leitrim Middle. Gabriel, who knew John Moriarty better than any one of us. And then we were having Diarmuid. So basically, I am actually very nervous, even though looking around, I recognise nearly everybody. You probably all sat in the Assembly Hall in Tarbert at some point, and therefore I should relax. But anyhow, my own book, it was very interesting. The other day, a friend of mine said that he had given the book to someone, and when the person handed it back, he said, after reading that now, I still don't know whether John Moriarty was a genius or half mad. And I thought, oh God, I thought I was clearing all that up. But it's very interesting what Martin was saying as well, that you'll always meet people who knew John Moriarty or who knew something about him in some way. And I remember when I was writing the book, Basil Brennan was a neighbour in Listowel, and his brother Jack was the person who gave John Moriarty The Origin of Species. And I started talking, I wanted to know more about Jack Brennan, so I started talking to Basil. And he said, Moriarty? He said, I think he definitely was mad. I saw him one day out in Ballybunion, and he was walking along the beach, and he had an apple in his hand. And he wasn't eating it, Mary. He was talking to the apple. So that was that bit. And the same thing, something quite similar happened in my own house. Invoking Ireland was on the table, and my daughter Sarah, who's here tonight, and I'm delighted about that, came in, picked it up, opened it, and said, Ma'am, are you sure he's not mad? So that was, and there is a bit of that. You will come across that time and again. But they say about genius that it's always on the margins. In Martin's book here, he says, genius dwells in the margins. And genius is always a little bit off. It doesn't conform. It cannot conform because it is always challenging the way we are. And that was the genius of John Moriarty. Aidan Matthews, the poet and broadcaster, once said about him that he was the Archbishop of the margins. So, who was he? This man who jumped ship and gave up, after 6 years, a professorship in Canada, and came back gardening in Ireland, and ended up writing books with very, very strange titles. What was he about? Well, I'm always afraid, when I'm asked that question, I'm often asked it, that I'll reduce him, that I won't be able for the enormity of this man, that I'll say something that'll make him sound small. And the last thing John Moriarty was small. He was absolutely enormous. And he had a huge amount to say. But I did actually manage to reduce him beautifully one evening, when Madeleine, that was Amanda mentioned earlier, his sister, said to me one day, will you tell us, what was he about? You must be able to tell us. Was he as, like, they say he was good, but what was he about? And I went about saying, well, Madeleine, he was about soul. And he was telling us that there's soul in us and that there's soul in the world. And really, that's the most important message he had for us. And she turned around and she said, Jesus, Mary and Joseph, sure, didn't we all know that? That was Madeleine. That was typical, I would imagine, Amanda will tell you, that is a typical Mary O'Brien, Mary Moriarty put down. You will just have the rug thrown out from under you. But John's own story, it's basically two stories. It was the story of his growing up in my van in a sheltering environment. An environment that was, let me say, it had great explanation for how you were in the world. He would say it himself, you came into this world, it was a world made 4,500 years ago by God. It was created. There was heaven, there was hell. There was a set of rules, you lived by them, and that was the way that you had to be in this world. It sheltered you. It was a very protected world, and it made great sense to an awful lot of people. He was also living in a world where the world of spirit was alive. Jamie Kazan's stories were stories about the spirit world. The myths he learned even in school, in his Latin and in his Greek, were myths about another world, about gods and goddesses. So that he lived in a very sheltering story. Gabriel already mentioned it. At the age of 17, he read The Origin of Species. This is where the Jack Brennan I'm talking about, he was in his class, some library was broken up, the book was banned in Ireland, and The Origin of Species got its way into the hands of 17-year-old boys. Now, I'd say they read it because they thought there might be very interesting things in it for 17-year-old boys. But John Moriarty actually stayed the pace with it. And of course, what did it do? It tore asunder the world that he had lived in. There was no sheltering story. There was no God. It was a bleak, scientific message. The world was made millions and millions of years ago. It was random. There was no heaven. There was no hell. The rule book was torn up. This was extraordinary for him because it shattered everything that he had ever been taught, that he had ever believed. It broke down all illusion. And it was a bleak, meaningless vision. All the Jamie and Kazan stories, they were all gone. So I see that that clash between the old story and the modern scientific story was the driving story in John Moriarty's life. He could not stop thinking, working about, because something in him, and I don't know where it came from, but it was intuitive, it was instinctive in him, that said, this scientific thing is not the whole story. There is far more to this world that we live in than the scientific message. Now, he believed it. He absolutely said, yes, this is right. I can see what they're saying. But some other part of him just couldn't accept the desolation and the isolation of it. And that's why he couldn't actually stay with the teaching. He told his father that with the national school teaching, he loved the children. It wasn't that he didn't love it, but he said, I was hungry for knowledge. He said he ravened his way through books and libraries, because at the time, at 17, he was totally isolated. The world around him, St. Michael's, it was all still living in the old story. Now, people may have known differently. People may have had other ideas, but he didn't know them. He hadn't heard those. So he was alone. He was man overboard. It was a cataclysm, and he was absolutely shattered. He went to UCD. He studied philosophy. He got the first honours degree. It didn't answer the questions. He said all they were asking in UCD were tidy questions, and they were giving tidy answers. They didn't answer the questions he wanted to ask. As he saw it, the problem with the scientific story was that if a thing could not be proven empirically, if it couldn't be proven QED, then it wasn't true at all. There was nothing there. And he couldn't actually take that on board. He honestly didn't believe it. Brendan Kennelly said to me one time, and this links into John as well. Brendan said that he was talking to a scientific friend one time in Trinity, and that he mentioned the word miracle. And the scientific friend said, there's no such thing as miracles, Brendan. All miracles are as yet undiscovered facts. Nothing but undiscovered facts. Now that, to John Moriarty, was an absolute abhorrence. Science put us into a nothing but universe. And there was no other way about it. And he would have seen that eventually as a kind of fundamentalism in itself, that it wouldn't look at anything beyond what was factual. And he used to tell a great story, a little Sufi parable. He would say, there was a man coming home one night, and he got to his own door, and he couldn't find the key of his house. So he went down on all fours. There was a street lamp there. He went down, and he was around under it, searching for the key of his house. A policeman comes along, and he goes down on all fours as well, and he's looking for the key of the house. Can't find it. Eventually he says to him, are you sure you lost it here? And the man said, no, I didn't lose it here. I lost it somewhere over there in the dark. And the policeman said, well, why aren't you over there in the dark looking for them? And he said, because there's no light over there. Now, the meaning, John Moriarty took that story and said, he's talking about the light, the intellectual light, the light of our rational thinking heads, that sees only with those glasses on, that only sees that story, and doesn't realise that there's a load more stories over there. Maybe there's something else going on that we don't know about at all, utterly over there in the dark. We've walked away from all of that, and we've bought into a story that Moriarty would say, again, is not the whole story. We have left behind an awful lot. Talking about leaving behind, when John was granted the doctorate in Galway, wasn't it? He got the honorary doctorate. Ignado Moriarty, who would be a cousin of Mihal's, was the provost of UCG at the time. And he made this tribute to John Moriarty. He said, the wise man, the sage, isn't walking out there ahead of us. He's walking behind us, picking up the riches and the treasures that we've left behind. And listening there again tonight to Martin, he's doing the same thing. He's picking up all those stories that we heard in school and we've abandoned. And he's picking them up and he's finding the riches that are in them. Moriarty was picking up the bits we abandoned in our, I suppose, following of the modern story, which is the myth of progress, the myth of science, where we've left behind so much else. And there's one other lovely little story that, it was my favourite story when I came to John first. It's what I call the first Amanda story. John was home from Connemara, Amanda was about 4 or 5. And John was left minding the house. I think it was Easter, and they were going to the Easter services, and John at the time was not going to the Easter services. So his mother warned him that there was a cow calving. And he was not to get lost in the books. He was to make sure that that cow was all right while they were away. So, dutifully, he kept an eye on the cow, and he took Amanda out with him. And the cow had started. And he said to Amanda, "Look, can you see his hooves coming out?" And Amanda said, "Well, that's all wrong." And John said, "Why? Why is it all wrong?" And Amanda said, "My head came first." Now, she was 4 or 5, and John was completely shocked that this little 4 or 5-year-old wasn't talking about being found as a baby under a head of cabbage or all the little stories that we were all told, but she kind of knew the story. So she said, and where did you come from? And I came out of Mammy's tummy. And then he thought he'd continue it going a bit, and he said, and where did Mammy come from? She came out of Granny's tummy. And that was grand. And where did Granny come from? At that point, there was nothing in Amanda's world before Granny. So she was stumped. She had no answer for the Granny question. And he went on and he pulled the calf, and all that was going on. And she was sitting there, and he described it beautifully. He says, with the little blondie curls of her, and her head, and she was concentrating and thinking and thinking and thinking. And eventually she burst out with it. And she said, I know where Granny came from. Out of her own tummy, I suppose. The first time I heard that, I thought it was simply a lovely anecdote. You know, I didn't see the kind of depth of it, but when he would tell it, he would go on to say, hers was the head of Newton. That was the head of Einstein. That was the head of all the great thinkers. Thinking, but limited by their own knowledge. Amanda gave her answer, out of the knowledge she had. But he's saying Einstein and Newton and all our great people, all our great minds are all talking out of their own experience, their own knowledge, and it's all limited. What he used to say was, we must always be vulnerable to further experience. Never ever think that you can nail your colours to any mast and say that that is the answer. And that is, to me, one of the most extraordinary messages from John Moriarty. He would quote, I think it was one of the Zen masters, "Give me your certainties and I will give you confusion." He spent his life examining the stories in which we live now and in which people in all past ages lived. I was talking tonight, before I came here, at my own kitchen table to some guests who were coming down to be here tonight. And we were talking about, I think it was Martin mentioned again, the Stonehenge of books around John Moriarty and all the photographs. And I was saying, what I could never actually fathom was the fact that he could keep all of what he read in his head. Not only could he remember it, but like the masses of it, he could keep it all in his head and he could synthesize it and give it to us in a simple, well, it wasn't always simple, no, that I would be exaggerating that. But when he was speaking, he did it so simply. He was a marvellous, marvellous speaker. But his ultimate conclusion was that no one story tells the whole story. Ultimately, he did find his own way back into the Christian story, but that's a story that I'd love to, we tell another night. I think we should actually have more nights in my van about John Moriarty. But what you will find in his work is wisdom, and more wisdom. The kind you will only find if you go to the hut at the edge of the village. And he took a long, hard look at the modern world, and he decided it was sorely in need of healing. And he set about trying to do it. He tells a story, or he would sometimes say, Paul Durkin, I think he said it to, and I think he said it to Amanda, I think I'm trying to save the world. Now, that's a big, big ask. But there's a beautiful quotation that he has in the end of, or I think it's in Bodh Gaya, where he says, Someone told him that there was a graffiti on a wall somewhere. How sad to be young and not want to change the world. And his answer was, how sad to be any age, 9 or 90, and not want to change the world. So that kind of leads me to his legacy. I think his legacy is a roadmap for a better way of being in the world. His message is a plea to all of us to change the way we behave towards the world. Now that would be taking in his whole environmental message and all of that, but it's bigger than that. And his challenge to us is to examine the story in which we are now living, this myth of progress. Does it nourish us? Is it sheltering us? Or is it preventing us from seeing a much bigger picture? And I'm going to finish with a challenge, I think, to my van. I think there's a very particular challenge here. He was the son of this place, hugely shaped by it, hugely. And I think it's from here that his message should actually be pushed out there into the rest of the world. His name is getting bigger and bigger. Martin is right. Like, there are more and more people coming to the work and the vision and the message of John Moriarty. I know, Amanda and I know it. We've kind of linked in with some Americans who are interested, and it's building and building, but it's still like there's a long, long road to go. But John, before he died, and in the very last couple of months, he had the plans built for what he was calling Shlina Firna, a Christian monastic hedge school that he wanted to develop at, down, I think it was near Kilgarvan that he had the site. Yeah. And the idea was that it was a message of hope, much as he saw despair all around him in the way the world is going. His message was one of hope. We can keep it alive, just as the monks did long ago. We can keep the vision of spirit and of soul alive in the world. And I honestly think that my van should be thinking of becoming a centre for sending the teaching of Moriarty out into the world. I see no reason why it can't be done. I mean, I think an awful lot of small places around this country are celebrating the Seamus Heaney's, the Patrick Kavanagh's, the Percy French, all of those. There's festivals everywhere, yearly, and they are celebrating their person. I think we here, I nearly consider myself a my vanner at this stage, although I don't know if all of you would have me, those of you who might have met me in school time and again, but I really do think that we should get something going here. I'm going to finish with my favourite quote. Thank you. I suppose after throwing that gauntlet down now, I'm just going to go back to where I started. It's not John Moriarty who was mad, not by a long shot. It's the world that we are living in now that has gone sorely mad. And I think we need to listen to his genius. And I do think, before it's too late, I think we do. But we have somebody who has a roadmap for us. And I'm going to just beautiful few lines. Clear days, this is John. Clear days bring the mountains down to my doorstep. Calm nights give the rivers their say. The wind puts its hand to my shoulder some evening. And then I don't think. I just leave what I'm doing and I go the soul's way. That's the Moriarty way. Thank you.
I think that says it all. John, as Mary has been saying, there's an American professor, I think he's Higgins, has said that John Moriarty is God's gift to Ireland. And John was very fond of quoting, saying that we should learn to walk beautifully on the earth. And I think Mary has explained to us how he got there. We're going to finish up now with a tune from Diarmid. And then I'll ask you, we're going to finish with a song. John Moriarty's favourite song was Peggy Gordon. You all, in those leaflets you have in your possession, got the words of Peggy Gordon. So we'll sing, Diarmid will play a tune first of all, and then we'll sing Peggy Gordon, and then we'll have a cup of tea, okay?
Thanks very much. So I'm going to finish with a few reels, and Gabriel mentioned earlier Martin Mulville, and he mentioned a tune called The Pride of My Van. So I'm going to give that a go. I haven't played it in a while, but no better place to play it than in my van itself. So I'll follow that with two of his compositions as well, called The High Road to Glyn and The Low Road to Glyn. So Martin Mulville was born in Ballygocklin in Glyn, not far from here, in 1923, and moved to America in the 50s, where he became renowned as a fiddle teacher, music teacher in general, but he taught every instrument. He was a fiddle and piano accordion player, and he brought the first bands back to Ireland in the 70s that won at the All-Ireland Flat Kyoles, and his pupils include the likes of Eileen Ivers and Tony DeMarco and Brian Conway, who are all renowned fiddle players. And the first tune that I'm playing, The Pride of My Van, he wrote this on the subway in New York when he was travelling around to his different classes. And he told the story that he was so engrossed in composing the tune that he went past his stop and went on another few stops because he wanted to finish it. So that was Martin Mulville. So can I also just say that I'm privileged and honoured to be on the stage with these four speakers here tonight, especially Mary McGillicuddy, who was my former secondary school principal and English teacher. And not alone that, I see three other teachers down there tonight that taught me as well, Mrs. Lyons, Mrs. McAllistrom and Mrs. O'Carroll. So I'd like to dedicate these tunes to them because they say we're all the product of a good teacher. So here we go.
Thank you very much. Can I thank everybody for coming? I've seen people here from America. I see people here from England. I see people here from Dublin. I see people here from all over Munster, Kerry and Cork and Limerick, and I want to thank you all very much for coming. I want to thank Diarmuid especially for being here tonight. As some of you know, there's a great music festival on in Castleisland, the Patrick O'Keefe Music Festival. Frankie Gavin is there tonight, Paddy Lacken is there tonight. Diarmuid could have been there tonight, but he chose to be here to celebrate John Moriarty with us tonight, and we really appreciate that. Can I thank Martin Shaw for bringing us back to the roots of story, the roots of our own story, the roots of the world stories. Martin, thank you very, very much. And lastly, can I thank in tandem Amanda and Mary for their beautiful insights into the mind and soul of John Moriarty and also my van. So thank you very much, David. Now, Diarmuid is going to play Peggy Gordon, which you got the words on this sheet here. If you know the words and feel like singing, please do. I lead you, so here we are. Okay, Diarmuid, take it away. Oh, Peggy Gordon, you are my darling. Come sit you down upon my knee. Come tell to me the very reason why I am silent so widely. I am so in love, and I can't deny it. My heart lies smothered in my breast. It's not for you to let the world know it. A troubled mind can know no rest. I did put my head to a cast of brandy. It was my fancy, I do declare. For when I'm grinning, I am always singing and wishing Peggy Gordon was there. I wish I was awaiting far across the briny sea, sailing over the deepest ocean, where the poor care never bothered me. I wish I was in some lonesome valley, where one kind cannot be found, where the pure words do change their voices, and every moment the dearest sound. Oh, Peggy Gordon, you are my darling. Come sit you down upon my knee. Come tell to me the very reason why I am silent so widely. So thank you very much. Can I thank the Village Festival Committee, Carmel Energetic Committee, Brenda Kennedy and Bobby Stack and everybody for getting involved in this celebration of John Moriarty. And can I thank our two cameramen, the two Hogans, father and son, for their work. Thank you very much.